Before the world ever met the rapper who called himself DMX, there was a little boy named Earl. He went through a lot of different things in his life, suffered a lot of pain, went through a lot of struggle, and didn't really know where he was heading in his life. Then one day, he heard this thing called hip hop, and it lit a fire under him that nothing else ever could. Slowly but surely, he pulled himself up out of the ghettos of Yonkers, New York, to become the best rapper in the city. Then perhaps the best rapper in the state. Then perhaps the best and greatest rapper for a time in the entire world. When he came on the scene as DMX, he brought his growl with him, he brought his barks with him, but most importantly, he brought his rough voice, his rough lyrics, and his rough life too. A seeming contradiction of explicit lyrics and then prayers, DMX was a conundrum that people always wanted to know more about. To that end, here's our story about the saga of DMX. DMX was born Earl Simmons on December the 18th, 1970 in Mount Vernon, New York, to Arnett Simmons and Joe Barker. Arnett was 19 when Earl was born, and she already had a 2-year-old daughter named Benita by another man. After Earl's birth, Arnett moved into a home for unwed mothers. At the same time, she asked her sister Laverne to take care of Benita for a while for her because Arnett said that her nerves were shot. When Arnett had to get a place of her own, she found out that Yonkers had more low-income housing to choose from than Mount Vernon did. Because of that, she moved to a small 1-bedroom place there in a building called the Roker. Earl was sickly as a child, inheriting allergies from his mother as well as asthma from his father. He would often wake up barely even able to breathe, and this would lead to numerous emergency room visits as well as overnight hospital stays. One time, he had to go back to the hospital 3 different times in one night because the medicine they prescribed for him kept making him sick. While that was bad, what may have been worse was the time that Earl got ran over by a car. One day, Earl found a dime on the ground. Excitedly, he ran across a busy street to spend his newfound money at the store. After making it safely across the street and buying a lollipop and a Super Ball, he began to cross the street again, and that's when it happened. The impact of the car hitting him knocked Earl halfway up the street. Strangely, even though he was badly hurt, he didn't feel anything. His main concern at that point was thinking that he would get a whipping from his mother for being outside when he was supposed to be in the house. When Earl tried to get up, a lady who was there told him to keep laying down the street. Eventually, an ambulance came for him, and luckily he didn't have any broken bones, and after a few weeks, he was able to recover. However, Earl's real pain came from something they didn't find out until much later. He found out that his getting run over could have gotten him paid. That was because the driver that hit him had not only run a red light, he was also drunk. About a month after his accident, an insurance representative came to his home and he offered Earl's mom $10,000 to settle the case. She told the man that she and her family were Jehovah's Witnesses and that their faith taught them to be self-sufficient. In other words, she turned the money down. As a child, Earl's mom would constantly tell him how he was the man of the house and how he had to take care of things. Earl took that responsibility seriously. When he would walk down the street with her, dudes hanging out in the corner used to turn their heads to check her out, and then they'd try to holler at her. Arnett never said anything to them or even looked at them. In response, the dudes would yell at her and call her hateful. Earl, who was about 4 years old at this time, didn't know what hateful meant, but he knew it must be bad. Earl hated the whole situation. He hated guys looking at his mother that way, and he especially hated when they call her that word. "Don't call my mother hateful," he'd say to the men, while mean-mugging them at the same time. In Earl's young mind, he was so angry at the men that he figured out a way and convinced himself that he could end each of their lives. Remember, this is what was going through the mind of a 4-year-old boy. Earl needn't have worried so much about protecting his mother from those dudes because she was already inviting plenty of other dudes into their house. There were many mornings when Earl got sent to the store when he woke up for bread, eggs, and cornflakes. That was because his mother had company and she wanted to make sure that she fed her guests. While she gladly fed her numerous one-night stands, she ignored Earl's request for sweet cereal. One time, Earl thought that he made a connection with one of his mother's boyfriends. This guy was different from the others because he'd actually stayed over a few weekends, and not just overnight. This guy used to cook homemade bread that Earl really liked. Additionally, not only did he watch TV with Earl, he also walked to the store with him once to buy some groceries. And Earl used to think that this guy was rich because he used cash to pay for things instead of having to use food stamps. However, the situation didn't last long, and eventually he was gone just like the other guys. One day, on his way home, Earl saw that man outside. Remembering how good that homemade bread had tasted, Earl approached the man to ask when he was going to come by to make some more of it. Sadly, Earl's feelings were hurt and his hopes were dashed when the man looked at Earl like he didn't even know who he was. Getting back to Earl's mother, after Earl was born, Arnett had 2 more boys. However, both children passed away at birth. Being the only boy that she had, Earl would think about how unlucky he was. Earl used to get beatings from Arnett seemingly because he represented all of the problems she had with men. On top of that, she beat him because he reminded her of his father. She would tell Earl how he was an ish, just like his daddy was an ish. Earl's father never lived with them, nor did he help at all with raising Earl. Since he was an artist, a couple of times he took Earl with him when he set up shop in New York City to try and sell some of his paintings. Painting was his passion, and even when he wasn't making any money from doing it, he refused to do anything else. In fact, homeless, he once lived in Central Park for several weeks until he got a painting job that paid. Earl enjoyed spending time with his father, and this was how he began learning how to draw. But their times together never lasted long. Earl's everyday reality always was waiting for him back in Yonkers. Getting back to Earl's punishments, when his mother got tired of doing it, she called one of her boyfriends over to come and do it for her. Meanwhile, Earl's sister Benita was the perfect child and didn't suffer the way Earl did. Well, most of the time, that is. One guy named Richie, who was the mailman, would not only deliver mail, he'd also hook up with Arnett. Once they finished doing the do, Arnett would tell Richie all the bad things that Earl and Benita had recently done. Each offense came with a certain number of hits. As a result, Richie would grab a belt, announce their sentences to both Earl and Benita, tell them to bend over, and then administer their punishment. If they dared move while he was whipping them, he'd start the count all over again. In 1975, Arnett moved the family to the School Street apartment complex. It was better, but it was still in the hood. Even though Earl had his own room, he was often kicked out of it and forced to sleep on the couch. That was because his Uncle Robert, Arnett's brother, would come by with his latest old lady. Sometimes his visits would just be for a day or so, but sometimes they'd last for weeks at a time. Despite him taking over his room, Earl enjoyed being around his uncle. Nicknamed Pinky, he would sometimes play with Earl, rolling his cars around on the floor with him. And this was important because Arnett wouldn't let Earl or Benita go outside without her. Since they lived on the 11th floor, Arnett reasoned that they lived too high from the ground floor for her to get to them if anything ever happened to them. As a result, Earl and Benita always had to stay in the house all day. That gave Earl plenty of time to work on his drawings. Once Earl began to go to school, he loved reading books by Dr. Seuss as well as any books with dinosaurs in them. And he was considered bright and he was in the advanced reading class throughout elementary school. Contrary to his bright nature, Earl found trouble outside of school. When he was only 7, he got caught shoplifting when he tried to steal a box of mince pies from a supermarket by stuffing them down his shirt. We're going to take a time out from our story to ask you to like, subscribe, share, comment, hit that notification bell, and repeat when it comes to our videos. Now, back to our story. Getting back to school, Earl became a great speller, which would come in handy. When he was in 3rd grade, every week at school they had spelling bees. The winner would get their name on the bulletin board, as well as a sandwich from Landy's Deli. This was important to Earl because he longed to eat something other than the free lunch that his punch card authorized him to receive every day. Everybody loved Landy's, but Earl couldn't afford to buy anything from there like some of the other kids could. Inspired by those sandwiches, Earl studied hard and he won the spelling bee every week. He soon looked forward to every Tuesday when he expected to get another one of those sandwiches. While he was praised for his spelling at school, his mother barely even paid attention to it. When he tried to talk to her about spelling, she often shooed him away. And this hurt Earl because he only wanted to share what he knew. He wanted his mother to know that he was a good kid. Having said that, Earl began doing things at school that made him a bad kid. Bored with schoolwork that came so easily to him, Earl began doing things such as shooting spitballs and throwing erasers across the room. These things, among others, would mean that he had to stay after school for detention. He didn't mind because he didn't want to be at home anyway. He also found that after school was a great time to see what the other kids had left in their desks. When the teacher left the room, Earl would take that opportunity to rummage through all the kids' things and steal their toys. One day after he had detention at school, he and another boy hung out around the boy's house. While normally Earl would get home after school around 4 o'clock, this time he was still gone and it had gotten dark outside, and he was still playing with the boy outside. Suddenly, a police car approached, and Earl got scared when he saw his mother in the back seat of the car. Scared because Earl hadn't come home, his mother had called the police, who took her around to search for Earl. Seeing the 2 boys playing in the street, she instantly recognized her son, even from a distance. When Earl got into the car, his mother was shaking and he could see that her eyes were red from crying. Why was that? Maybe she did care about him. When they got home, Earl's Uncle Pinky was there. He told Arnett not to whip Earl and that instead she should just talk to him. Surprisingly, she did just that, and she took time to explain to Earl how much his not coming home had scared her, and she also told him that she wouldn't beat him this time because she was just so happy that he was okay. Then she ended their conversation like this: "But if you ever do that again, I'm gonna," and you fill in what comes after "I'm gonna." 2 days later, Earl did the same thing again. This time, he hung out at the park near his home until about 7 o'clock in the evening. When his mother found him, she made good on her threat at the end of their previous conversation 2 nights earlier, because she started beating him in the park, and she beat him all the way home from the park. Then when she got home, she had access to her entire arsenal: the extension cord, a hanger, a broom. This time, she chose the stick. From there, Earl's punishment continued until she hit him in the face with the stick accidentally. At the same time, Earl was becoming the boy that people didn't want their children playing with because he was just too bad. After a while, Earl began spending time at his paternal grandmother's house. Mary Ella Holloway had 11 children, but Earl was her first grandson. He enjoyed spending time over there. Earl had 2 uncles that were actually younger than he was. He enjoyed playing with them, and he loved the fact that he actually got to play outside over at his grandma's. He also didn't have to worry about the constant beatings he was used to receiving while he was over there. His grandma doted on him, and at the same time, never liked Earl's mother. She also felt that Earl's mother should be doing more for the boy besides just beating him to dust. She thought that Arnett should be working more with the school to help Earl avoid all the trouble he'd been getting into. Earl would hear his mother and his grandmother arguing on the phone about these very subjects. Arnett would respond to Mariella's complaints about her by reminding Mariella that her son wasn't helping to take care of his own son. At Grandma's, Earl especially loved Sunday dinner. There was always good food, plenty to eat, and lots of family that was having a good time together. Unfortunately, his mother rarely let him stay at Grandma's for more than a weekend at a time. When he was 10 years old and in the 5th grade, Earl's abuse at home came to the attention of people at school. He was often in trouble at school, which also meant that he spent a lot of time in the front office. Eventually, somebody noticed that Earl always had a busted lip, or he couldn't sit down comfortably because of the welts on his butt. One day, when he came to the office with a badly swollen lip, a guidance counselor asked him what had happened to him. Earl admitted that he'd gotten beaten at home. They then took him to the nurse, who lifted Earl's shirt. He had bruises on his back and arms, along with marks on the back of his legs. All of this was reported to the authorities, who then began talking about taking Earl away from Arnett. Arnett argued that if Earl wasn't so bad, she wouldn't have to punish him so often. It was recommended that Earl go see a child psychologist, and his mother took him to see one several times. However, this didn't help, and Earl continued to act out in class. He was always fighting other students while also cursing out his teachers. Finally, the school had enough. For the final weeks of the school year, they had Earl stay home, and they had a tutor come over to his apartment to hold his classes there. At the same time, the courts ruled that since Arnett couldn't control Earl, he'd have to spend 18 months at the Julia Dyckman Andrus Children's Home. This was a school/dorm type facility. Earl immediately found that he'd have no problem staying there. He was happy with the amount of times he got to eat. "What? We're about to eat again?" he would say to his teachers. Not only did he get 3 large meals a day, he also got dessert too. On top of that, he got a snack in the evening. Earl also loved the fact that there was color TV to watch and a stereo that he could actually touch. He got his own set of pajamas, and he even got $3.50 a week allowance for doing chores. This allowed Earl to get some candy and a Mad magazine every weekend. Eventually, though, trouble would find Earl again. After being at the facility for about a year, Earl attacked one of the other students during class. The boy's parents insisted on pressing charges for assault. This earned Earl a trip to the youth division of the Yonkers City Jail, and he had to stay there until his mother came to get him. Once she got there, she proceeded to start hitting him. "You can punish him when you get home," the cop on duty told her. When his mother took Earl back to school, Earl was no longer allowed to be a part of the school's population. He was forced to stay in a small, unused office to take his classes alone and also to eat his meals there. During the evenings, he stayed and slept in the infirmary alone too. He wasn't allowed to play outside or to have any contact with other students. This setup lasted until he completed his 18 months at the facility. After leaving the facility, Earl tried to stay at his grandma's house as much as he could. He hated staying with his mother because Richie the mailman was still making his house calls. Richie also was still ready to administer punishment for any wrongdoings that Arnett told him about. In one particular instance, tired of absorbing beatings, Earl cursed Richie out. Since the beatings weren't going to happen, Arnett began isolating Earl in his room. First, she would do it for one day at a time. Then it became for an entire weekend. Then it became for an entire week. Then for an entire month. No matter what the length of his punishment was, though, none of it worked. In 1981, Arnett even grounded him for an entire summer, for all of June, July, and August. The worst part was Earl didn't even know what he was being punished for. Again, nothing worked. At the same time, Earl was getting bigger and faster, and sometimes he would simply run away from his mother when she tried to hit him. This led her to come up with another move. A sleeping target can't move, so she began to hit him while he was sleeping. What she would do is sit on him while he was sleeping, then start hitting him. Eventually, Earl would wake up, begging her to stop because he couldn't breathe. She would respond by telling him that she'd take him to the emergency room for his asthma, but only after she was finished beating him. Ooh, Lord, we're going to stop part 1 right here. Oh, wow. DMX mama's something else, ain't she? Lord. We now begin to get some insight as to why DMX was the way he was. Hopefully none of you listeners had to go through anything like this, but we know that people had to suffer through things like this are out there. Were you able to overcome a childhood like this? And do you know of anyone who had to suffer through something like this? Let us know in the comments. Thank you all for checking out our video. We appreciate you spending time with us. We'll be coming out with part 2 of our DMX saga on Friday. Be sure and come back to see what happens next. Thanks again, and see you at part 2.